As night blanketed the city in silence, Luke, a millionaire who rarely found moments of peace, drove without hurry. The hum of his car was the only sound as he crossed a desert bridge, savoring the calm. But something caught his eye, a huddled figure, trembling under the faint glow of a streetlight. At first, he thought it was just another homeless soul, lost in the city's shadows. But then, something shimmered in the woman's hands, a flash of metal that made his heart stop. It was a bracelet. The bracelet. The one his mother had worn, for as long as he could remember. Overcome with disbelief, Luke pulled over, his breath catching as he approached. Kneeling before the woman, tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "Mom." The streetlights cast uneven shadows as the rain began to lightly fall, drumming softly against the pavement. Luke stared at the hunched figure, wrapped in tattered rags, her face hidden by tangled hair. She was almost part of the decayed urban landscape, but he couldn't take his eyes off the bracelet, his mother's bracelet. It was impossible. She had vanished years ago without a trace. "Are you all right?" Luke's voice cracked as he stepped closer. The woman didn't respond. As she slowly lifted her head, Luke's world collapsed. The face beneath the grime, behind the years of neglect and suffering, was May. His mother. "This can't be," he muttered, stumbling back in shock. She blinked, as if trying to recognize him, but her eyes were lost, distant. The woman before him was a ghost, a shadow of the mother who had disappeared from his life. Luke's mind spun. Years ago, he had searched everywhere, hired investigators, and plastered her face across newspapers. But now, she sat before him, broken and lost under an abandoned bridge. "How did you get this?" Luke asked, his voice thick with disbelief, pointing to the bracelet. May glanced at it, as if only now realizing she was still holding it. Her fingers caressed the cold metal, but her eyes were vacant, struggling to connect fragmented memories. Kneeling in the light rain, Luke's voice cracked again. "Mum, is it really you? How did you end up here? Where have you been all this time?" Tears rolled down May's face, mingling with the dirt as she shook her head, unable to answer. Desperate to help, Luke wrapped his coat around her trembling shoulders. "Come on, let's get you out of here," he said, steadying his voice as he helped her to her feet. Each step was slow, painful, as if her body had forgotten how to move. In the car, silence enveloped them. Luke could hear her erratic breathing beside him, but her eyes remained fixed on the void. "I need to understand what happened, Mom," he whispered, as he pulled away from the bridge. "You disappeared for so long. We thought you were dead." May glanced at him but said nothing, her mind seemingly trapped between past and present. Luke's heart ached. The mother who had once been his rock was now so fragile, so broken. He knew that the road to answers would be long and painful, but for now, he was just grateful to have found her alive. As he drove through the city streets, memories of his childhood flashed before him, his mother's laughter, her warmth, and that bracelet always on her wrist. It was a symbol of their bond, now so distant. He couldn't stop wondering how she had ended up in this state. When they reached his apartment, Luke parked and gently helped May out of the car. The rain had slowed, but the cold seeped into their bones. Carefully guiding her into the building, Luke couldn't help but notice how unsteady she was, as if the clean, well-lit space was foreign to her. "We're almost there," he whispered as they entered the elevator. In his apartment, he settled her on the sofa, grabbing a blanket to wrap around her frail body. May stared at her trembling hands, lost in silence. Luke knelt in front of her, desperate for answers. "Mum, can you tell me what happened?" he asked gently. Where have you been? Why did you disappear? We spent years looking for you." May's voice was barely audible as she finally spoke. "Luke, I don't remember much. I just know. I had to run. I had no choice." "Run from what?" Luke pressed, gripping her hands. "Who hurt you?" Tears rolled down her face again. "I don't remember. Everything is so confusing. I just know I had to leave." Luke's chest tightened, frustration and despair mixing inside him. He stood up, pacing the room, his mind racing. "We need help," he said firmly. "I'm calling someone. A doctor. Anyone who can help you recover your memory." May clutched the bracelet, her fingers trembling. This is all I have left," she murmured. Luke froze, his heart aching. "That bracelet," he whispered. "You always wore it. It was always a part of you." In that moment, Luke realized just how far his mother had fallen, how much she had lost. The bracelet, once a symbol of their connection, now felt like the only thread tying her to the life she once had. Tears welled up in Luke's eyes as he knelt beside her again, determined to find a way to help her heal, no matter how long it would take. "It was a gift from Grandma, remember?" Luke's voice cracked, trying to reach through the fog that seemed to cloud May's mind. "You never took it off. How do you still have it? How is that even possible?" May looked at him, her eyes blank and distant, offering no explanation. Luke realized in that moment he wouldn't get answers tonight. He needed help. His mind raced, and one name came to him: Enzo, his trusted friend, who also happened to be a skilled detective. Enzo would know where to start. Luke picked up his phone and began dialing, but hesitated. He looked at May, whose fragile state tugged at his heart. "Enzo can help us, Mum. He's discreet, and he can figure out what happened. You trust me, don't you?" May stared at him, uncertainty clouding her expression, but after a long pause, she slowly nodded. It was enough for Luke to feel a small flicker of hope. "I'll take care of you," he promised, his voice trembling. "We'll figure out what happened, no matter how long it takes." Luke made the arrangements for Enzo to come over the next morning. As he hung up the phone, he glanced at May again. There were so many unanswered questions, mysteries surrounding her disappearance. But more than anything, there was the glimmer of a new beginning. They weren't alone anymore. The next morning, sunlight crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow in Luke's apartment. The night had been long and restless. May had fallen asleep on the couch, but her sleep was plagued by murmurs and whispered nightmares. Luke, on the other hand, barely slept. He sat at his desk most of the night, sifting through memories, trying to piece together a puzzle that felt unsolvable. As he sipped his coffee, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the quiet apartment. Luke stood quickly and opened the door to reveal Enzo, who entered with a worried look on his face. "You had me worried last night," Enzo said, giving Luke a firm pat on the shoulder. "What's going on?" Luke closed the door and motioned toward the couch. "It's her, Enzo. My mum. I found her last night. She was on the streets dressed in rags, and she barely remembers anything." Enzo's sharp eyes took in the sight of May from across the room, his brows furrowed in disbelief and concern. "That's unbelievable, Luke. After all these years, she just reappears. Something doesn't add up." "I know," Luke sighed heavily, running his hands through his hair. "She can't tell me what happened. She remembers bits and pieces, like she was running from something. But from what? And why?" Enzo sat down at the table, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Let's start from the beginning. You mentioned something about a bracelet?" Luke nodded, gesturing toward the bracelet still clutched tightly in May's hands as she slept. "Yes. She never took it off when I was a kid. It was a gift from my grandmother. I thought I'd never see it again, but there it is. Enzo took the bracelet and examined it closely, his experienced eyes narrowing as he ran his fingers over the details. This is more than just a simple piece of jewelry, Luke. It looks old, valuable. There could be more to this than meets the eye. Maybe it's a clue. Luke, feeling overwhelmed, sank into a chair and rubbed his face with his hands. I don't know, Enzo. Everything's so confusing. She seems so broken. Enzo nodded thoughtfully, glancing at May before focusing on Luke. We'll figure it out, but it's going to take time. This bracelet might be our first step to understanding what happened to her. There's a story here, Luke, and we're going to uncover it. Luke looked at his friend, grateful for the support. He knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but with Enzo by his side, they might finally start to uncover the truth behind May's disappearance. I can't stand seeing her like this, Luke said, his voice tight with emotion. Enzo placed the bracelet back on the table and locked eyes with Luke. She needs professional help, someone who can help her work through whatever's going on in her mind. But I'll dig into this too. There's something bigger here, Luke, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. Luke nodded, grateful for his friend's steady support. She talked about running away, but running from who, or what? I feel like the key is, in those years, she was gone. Before they could continue, May began to stir on the couch, her eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her gaze as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Luke rushed to her side. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She blinked slowly, trying to adjust to the soft light. "Where am I?" Her voice was weak, as if each word took effort. "You're at my apartment," Luke explained gently. "You stayed here last night. This is my friend Enzo. He's here to help, too." May looked at Enzo, but her gaze remained distant, as if she were looking through a fog. "I don't remember much," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But there's this feeling like I've been watched. For a long time. Always running. Always hiding." Luke and Enzo exchanged a quick glance. It was the first time May had given any tangible clue, even if it was just a vague sensation. Enzo leaned forward, his tone soft but serious. "May, can you remember anything else? Anyone? Anything at all?" She rubbed her forehead, the effort of recalling memories seeming too much to bear. "There was a man. I think. A name. Vittorio." Her voice quivered. "He wanted me gone. I knew too much. Something I wasn't supposed to know." A chill ran down Luke's spine. Vittorio. The name echoed in his mind like a warning, ominous and dangerous. "Vittorio who? What did you know?" Luke pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. May shook her head, clearly exhausted. "I don't know. I don't know any more." Enzo, recognizing that pushing too hard could do more harm than good, stood up and looked at Luke. "We have enough for now. Let her rest. I'll start digging into this Vittorio lead and get back to you with more information." Luke watched as Enzo prepared to leave, his heart heavy. "Enzo, thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you." "We'll figure this out, Luke," Enzo reassured him. "I'll look into Vittorio Conti. He could be the key to everything." Luke tried to focus, but his mother's words echoed incessantly in his mind. Vittorio. He didn't know much about the name, but if May had mentioned it amid the chaos of her memories, it had to mean something important. It was the thread he needed to pull. But who was Vittorio? And how did he connect to May's disappearance? As Luke paced around the apartment, lost in thought, Enzo was already taking the first steps of the investigation. Known for his meticulous work, Enzo had a reputation for uncovering secrets hidden in the darkest corners of society. He knew Vittorio wasn't a common name, and it didn't take long before he began piecing together a web of connections that might lead back to Luke's family. Later that morning, Enzo arranged a meeting with Mario, one of his most reliable informants. They met in a discreet cafe, the kind where no one paid attention to two men having a quiet conversation about powerful people. "Vittorio Conti," Mario repeated, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Yeah, I know the name. Heard about him a while ago. Old-school businessman. But he always had a foot in, the illegal stuff." Enzo nodded, urging him to go on. "And where is he now?" Mario raised his eyebrows, as if the answer was obvious. "Disappeared. About 10 years ago. No one knows if he was killed, went into hiding, or just dropped off the grid. But back then, he was known for some shady business. Money laundering, peddling influence. You know the type." Enzo frowned, thinking through the implications. "So, you think he could still be involved in something after all this time?" Mario shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Could be. Guys like him don't just disappear without a trace. They leave breadcrumbs. But it's hard to tell if he's still pulling strings or if someone else picked up where he left off." Enzo's mind was already racing. If Vittorio Conti had been involved in shady dealings, and May somehow knew too much, it could explain everything, but how deep did this go? And what had happened to Vittorio? "Thanks, Mario," Enzo said, standing up. "Keep your ears open. I'll need more information soon." As Enzo left the cafe, his mind buzzed with possibilities. Vittorio Conti. Was he still out there, or had someone taken over his empire? And more importantly, what did May know that made her a target? It was the beginning of a puzzle that would take all of Enzo's skill to solve. But one thing was clear. Luke's mother had stumbled into something dangerous, and they were just scratching the surface. Someone like Vittorio always has allies, people willing to keep his secrets, whether out of loyalty or fear. Enzo knew this all too well as he left the cafe, his mind buzzing with possibilities. If Vittorio Conti was still alive, or if someone was operating in his name, it meant that Luke's mother had been running from something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Back at the apartment, Luke was trying to calm May down. She was agitated, pacing around the room like a shadow of her former self. Her hands trembled, and even though she stayed silent, her eyes told a story. There was more behind her silence than she could bring herself to say. "Mum," Luke called softly, sitting next to her on the couch. "I need you to trust me. Enzo is looking into this man named Vittorio, but I need more. Anything you can remember, any detail might help us." May met his gaze, her eyes tired, but holding a flicker of determination. "Luke, I didn't want you to be involved in this," she whispered, her voice low but full of emotion. "I did what I did to protect you. It wasn't because I wanted to abandon you. I was trying to save our family." Luke leaned in closer, desperate to understand. "Protect us from what, Mum?" "From who?" May closed her eyes and took a deep breath, clearly struggling to piece together the scattered fragments of her memory. "Vittorio, he was a powerful man," she began, her voice trembling. "He knew things, secrets that weren't supposed to come out. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time and learned things I shouldn't have. He hunted me down, threatened me. I had to run, Luke. I couldn't let him find you." A cold chill swept over Luke as he listened. His mother had been entangled in something dark, and now it had come crashing back into their lives. "So you ran?" "To protect me?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with tension. May nodded slowly. "I knew that if I stayed, you would be in danger too." Vittorio had eyes everywhere. He controlled more than we could ever imagine. Luke took her frail hands in his, the weight of her words sinking in. "But why now? Why come back to the city? Do you think he's still looking for you?" May, lowered her gaze, her uncertainty clear. "I don't know, Luke. Maybe he's forgotten about me, or maybe he's dead. But I've always lived with the fear that if he, or his men, found me, I wouldn't get another chance." Luke stood up, pacing the room as his mind raced. He needed answers, but they were running out of time. "Then we need to act fast," he said, his voice tense. "Enzo is already investigating Vittorio. We have to figure out if he's still a threat." May looked at her son, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Luke, you need to be careful. Vittorio, he wasn't just powerful. He was dangerous. If he's still out there—" "We'll be careful, Mom," Luke reassured her, though his mind was spinning. He knew they were walking into a storm, but he had to see it through. Enzo would uncover the truth about Vittorio, and together they would figure out how to keep his mother safe. But one thing was clear. This was no longer just about the past. Vittorio's reach was far, and if he was still out there, they were running out of time to protect the present. If he's still out there, we're going to find him, and this time he won't hurt you again. Later that day, Enzo returned to Luke's apartment with a serious look on his face. "I managed to dig up some information," Enzo said. "Vittorio Conti was a big player back in the 90s. He ran a number of shell companies, skirting the line between legal and illegal business. But about 10 years ago, something big happened, and he disappeared off the radar. The thing is, he had plenty of enemies, and just as many allies. So, if he's gone, there's a good chance someone else is running things now." Luke clenched his fists, feeling anger rise within him. "So that's it. He might be gone, but the fear he created is still out there." Enzo nodded. "We need to be careful. This isn't just about getting answers. If Vittorio or anyone connected to him catches wind that we're digging, we could end up on their radar." Luke glanced at his mother, who sat quietly on the couch, her hands fidgeting with the bracelet. He then turned back to Enzo, his voice firm. "No matter what comes, we're seeing this through. I won't let my mum live in fear for another day." Enzo placed a reassuring hand on Luke's shoulder. "We'll figure out what happened, and we'll take down anyone still pulling the strings." The tension between Luke and Enzo grew as the truth about Vittorio Conti began to emerge. Each piece of information they uncovered didn't just bring them closer to answers. It opened up more questions. Luke was determined not to leave his mother to her fate again. But he knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. May sat at the table, absent-mindedly playing with the bracelet, the only link between her fractured memories and the present. Though her gaze was distant, Luke could tell she still felt threatened, even if she couldn't recall everything. He couldn't blame her. The trauma she had endured had left her shattered in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Later that morning, after a long session of research and phone calls, Enzo returned with a new report in hand. His usual serious demeanor was now laced with something else, an expression that told Luke he had found something significant. "I've got news," Enzo said, sitting down at the table across from Luke and May. "Vittorio Conti might have disappeared, but I tracked down one of his old associates, a man named Angelo Rossi. He was a lawyer, but also got his hands dirty with shady deals. His name came up in multiple investigations, but he always slipped through the cracks." Luke frowned. "And what does he have to do with my mom?" "Angelo was close to Vittorio," Enzo explained, "and it seems like around the time your mother disappeared, they were involved in some kind of deal. I don't know the exact details yet, but I have reason to believe Angelo was behind many of the threats made against her." At the mention of the name, May slowly looked up, her eyes narrowing in recognition. "Angelo," she murmured, almost to herself. "He was there. The last time I felt safe." Luke stared at her, surprised. "You remember Angelo?" She nodded, her eyes unfocused as memories started to return. "I knew he was involved in something big. I started to realize something was wrong with the transactions, the documents they didn't want anyone to see. I was just a secretary, but I saw too much. Luke's heart tightened. Is that why you ran, Mum? I had no choice, May said, her voice gaining strength. They knew I had seen something important, something that could bring down Vittorio's empire. I tried to keep my head down, but when Angelo came to threaten me, I knew I had to disappear. If I didn't leave, they would have killed me. Enzo, listening carefully, leaned forward. Do you remember what you saw? What was at the center of those documents? May closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if dredging up the past was physically painful. I remember something about a network of people involved in illegal activities. It wasn't just about money. There was information trafficking, secrets that could destroy powerful people. I don't know all the details, but Vittorio was at the heart of it. Luke looked at Enzo, his hands trembling with anger and tension. We need to find Angelo. If he's still out there, he could be the key to figuring out what happened to my mother. Enzo nodded. I'm already on it. Angelo isn't active in business circles anymore, but I found out he's been hiding out at a remote property. He's been staying out of the spotlight these past few years, but if he's still involved in Vittorio's old operations, this could be our shot at getting some real answers. Luke, filled with a renewed sense of urgency, looked at his mother. She had been running for so long, living in fear of the shadows from her past. Now, it was time to confront those shadows head-on. Luke knew what they were walking into was dangerous. Just mentioning Vittorio's name and dealing with his associates carried risks, but now they were going after someone who held crucial information. I'm going with you, Luke said, the determination clear in his voice. Enzo frowned, clearly hesitant. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Luke. If Angelo realizes we're on to him, he could vanish again, or worse, retaliate. I need to be careful with how I approach him. I understand the risk, Enzo. But this is personal, Luke replied, his tone firm. He threatened my mother's life. He forced her into hiding for years. I can't just sit back and watch. Enzo studied Luke for a moment, seeing the passion and resolve behind his words. Finally, he sighed, conceding. All right, but we have to be quick and discreet. If Angelo's still connected to Vittorio's old network, we don't have much time before they catch wind of us. As Enzo laid out the plan to track down Angelo Rossi, Luke turned to his mother, who sat quietly, her thoughts distant. We're going to fix this, Mom. I promise, Luke said, his voice full of assurance. No matter what happens, we'll uncover the whole truth. May didn't respond immediately, but a faint glimmer of hope appeared in her eyes, something Luke hadn't seen in a long time. I just want it to be over, Luke, she whispered, her voice fragile. I just want to live without fear. It will be, Luke said, gripping her hand tightly. I'll make sure of it. That night, the wind howled outside as Luke mentally prepared for what was to come. Enzo had secured the location of Angelo's property, and they planned to head there the next day, hoping he would provide the missing pieces to finally unravel the mystery surrounding May and Vittorio Conti. But Luke knew this journey was far from over. Every new discovery seemed to pull them deeper into a web of secrets and threats. Even so, he was determined to see it through, for his mother, for himself, and for all the years lost to fear and hiding. The next morning, Luke and Enzo left early, leaving May to rest in Luke's apartment. Neither had slept much, their minds restless with possible scenarios and outcomes. Now they were on the road, heading toward Angelo Rossi's supposed hideout. The drive was long, taking them far outside the city, into a more remote and quiet area. Enzo drove, and the silence between them was thick, weighted by the gravity of what they were about to do. Both men understood the risks, but knew this was necessary. "If Angelo's still there, do you think he'll talk?" Luke asked, breaking the tense silence. Enzo kept his eyes on the road, thinking for a moment. "Hard to say. If he's been hiding for this long, he'll be suspicious. We'll need to approach him carefully. Push too hard, and he might shut down, or worse, bolt." Luke nodded, feeling the pressure of the situation grow heavier with every passing mile. His mother's safety hinged on what they learned from Angelo, and failure wasn't an option. Finally, after several hours, they pulled up to an old, decaying house tucked away behind tall trees. The property looked abandoned, with paint peeling off the walls and the garden overtaken by weeds. The whole place seemed forgotten, as if it had hidden itself from the world. "This is it," Enzo said, cutting the engine. The two men stepped out of the car, their footsteps nearly silent in the stillness of the surrounding woods. Luke felt a shiver of unease crawl up his spine. The air around the house was heavy, as if it carried the weight of secrets buried deep. Enzo knocked firmly on the front door, the sound echoing through the house. Silence. They waited for a moment, listening, but nothing stirred inside. Enzo knocked again, this time harder. Still no answer. "Maybe he ran," Luke muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. Enzo glanced around, then cautiously reached for the doorknob. The door was unlocked. Enzo exchanged a quick look with Luke, and they both knew they had to push forward. As Enzo nudged the door open, the loud creak pierced the unsettling silence inside the house. They stepped into the dim, musty interior. The air was thick with the smell of mold and dust, the windows heavily curtained, casting the entire place in darkness. The house had been abandoned for some time, but the signs of recent life were undeniable. Dirty coffee cups littered the table, papers scattered across the floor, and a chair that had clearly been moved not long ago. "He's been here," Enzo whispered, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Luke's heart pounded in his chest. If Angelo was still hiding out in the house, he could be watching them at this very moment. They needed to move quickly. Enzo began searching through the rooms, while Luke wandered into a smaller room at the back of the house. A bookshelf lined with dusty, untouched books caught his attention. Something felt different in here, more organized, as though someone had recently spent a lot of time in the space. Luke ran his hand along one of the shelves, noticing one book that seemed slightly out of place, as if it had been handled recently. He tugged at the book, and suddenly, a small compartment hidden behind the bookshelf slid open. His pulse quickened as he peered inside the compartment to find a well-preserved wooden box. "Luke," Enzo called from another room, "I found some notes that might belong to Angelo." Holding the box tightly, Luke hurried to meet Enzo. "I found something too," he said, lifting the box for Enzo to see. Enzo glanced at it, intrigued. "Let's open it." Carefully, Luke lifted the lid of the box. Inside was a leather-bound journal, worn with age, and some folded papers with Vittorio Conti's name, highlighted in multiple places. Luke flipped open the journal and skimmed the first few pages. It was full of personal notes from Angelo Rossi, detailing his years of involvement with Vittorio. But one passage in particular stopped Luke cold. "May Torres knows too much." She saw the documents linking Vittorio to the information trafficking network. "He asked me to take care of her, but I can't take that risk. If anything happens to her, the entire operation could collapse. I need to find a way to keep her silent without drawing attention." Luke's blood ran cold. Angelo had known all along. He knew what his mother had uncovered, and he was deeply involved in the whole thing. The fact that Angelo had hesitated to take drastic action against May suggested he was scared of something bigger. Enzo, reading over Luke's shoulder, shook his head slowly. "It looks like Angelo was in deep, and if he held back on harming your mom, it's because he knew any wrong move could bring the whole thing crashing down." Luke snapped the journal shut, rage boiling inside him. So he ran. He knew the walls were closing in. But why didn't we find him here? Enzo pointed to the scattered papers on the table. He might have left in a hurry. These papers mention offshore bank accounts and properties abroad. It's possible he realized we were closing in and bolted. Before Luke could respond, they both heard a noise outside. Both men tensed, immediately on high alert. "Someone's out there," Enzo whispered, moving stealthily toward the window. He peered through a crack in the curtains and spotted a figure slipping into the woods nearby. "We've got company." Luke's stomach churned. "Is it Angelo?" "Maybe," Enzo replied, already heading for the door. "We can't let him get away." They bolted from the house, but the figure was already disappearing into the dense forest. Luke and Enzo ran after him, but the darkness of the woods made it difficult to keep up. "Don't lose him," Luke shouted as they weaved between trees. But the man was fast, and before long he vanished completely into the shadows. Luke skidded to a stop, panting and frustrated, his heart hammering in his chest. Enzo came up beside him, equally out of breath. "He knew we were there," Enzo muttered. "Now we know for sure Angelo is still alive." Luke clutched Angelo's journal tightly, feeling a mix of frustration and relief. "We need to find him. He's the key to unlocking everything about my mother's past." Enzo nodded. "Now that we know he's out there, we'll tighten the net. He won't stay hidden forever." With heavy hearts, Luke and Enzo walked back to the car, Angelo Rossi's journal in hand and a head full of unanswered questions. Though they had found a crucial lead, they knew their work was far from over. Angelo had slipped away again, but they now knew he was alive and aware that they were on his trail. The chase was only just beginning. The mood between Luke and Enzo was heavy as they drove away from Angelo's property, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of what they had uncovered loomed large, with Luke clutching Angelo's journal tightly. He couldn't stop thinking about the words he'd read. His mother had been in far more danger than he ever imagined, tangled in a web of crime that went beyond Vittorio Conti. She wasn't just in peril because of what she knew. Her very existence was a threat to these powerful people. "We need to move fast, Enzo," Luke said, breaking the silence. His voice was tense as he glanced at the journal in his hands. Now that Angelo knows we're after him, he could try to disappear again. We can't let him slip away this time. Enzo, ever the pragmatist, nodded. "I know, but right now, we have an advantage." He gestured to the journal. "This gives us a starting point, something solid to follow. Now that we know what was at stake, we can investigate the names in here and figure out who else is involved." Luke flipped through the journal again, more carefully this time. As he skimmed the pages, a pattern began to emerge. Several names kept popping up, aside from Vittorio and Angelo. There were references to others tied to the information trafficking network and financial crimes. "Look at this," Luke said, pointing to one particular entry. "Here, Angelo mentions a man named Alberto Galli. He was one of the main people managing the financial side of Vittorio's operations. His name shows up several times." Enzo leaned over, his brow furrowing. "Alberto Galli. I've heard that name before. He's a respected banker in Milan, works with high-end clients and major corporations. But there have always been rumors that he's involved in some shady transactions." Enzo shook his head. "If he's part of this, it explains a lot." Luke felt a chill run down his spine. If Alberto Galli's in on this, then we're dealing with a much bigger conspiracy than we thought. Vittorio wasn't just any criminal. He had connections to influential people. "Exactly," Enzo agreed. "And now that we have these names, we can start pulling the threads that connect them. Angelo probably hesitated to go after your mother because he knew it would attract attention from these other players. He was caught in a web, and now we're stuck right in the middle of it. As they continued discussing, Enzo's phone rang. He answered quickly, his face shifting from seriousness to concern as he listened. "I understand," he said into the phone. "Keep me posted." He hung up, turning to Luke with a grim expression. "This isn't good." Luke's heart sank. "What happened?" "I just got word from my contact in the police. There's been an attack at the house of one of Vittorio's former associates, a lawyer who was tied to some of his operations. He was found dead this morning." A chill ran through Luke. "Do you think it's connected to what we're investigating?" Enzo nodded. "It's too much of a coincidence to be unrelated. Angelo is on the run, and whoever is still running Vittorio's network is tying up loose ends. They're eliminating anyone who knows too much." Luke's stomach twisted. "That means my mother is still in danger." "She's safe for now," Enzo reassured him. "They don't know how close we are to uncovering the truth. But you're right. We need to move quickly. We'll make sure your mother is protected while we dig deeper into this." As they drove back to the city, the tension between them grew heavier. The danger surrounding Luke's mother was far greater than he had ever realized. Vittorio and Angelo weren't just isolated criminals. They were part of a larger network, connected to powerful, resourceful people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. When they arrived back at Luke's apartment, May was sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at the bracelet she hadn't let go of since it had resurfaced. When she saw Luke and Enzo walk in, her face immediately betrayed her concern. "What did you find out?" she asked, her voice trembling. Luke exchanged a glance with Enzo before sitting down beside her. "Mom, we need to talk. We found proof that you were being watched, threatened by Angelo Rossi and Vittorio Conti. But it's bigger than that. There are other powerful people involved, people who don't want the truth to come out." At the mention of Vittorio's name, May seemed to shrink in her seat, visibly shaken. "I tried to run from them. I thought if I disappeared, they'd forget about me." "I know, Mom. But now we know that Angelo's running too. He was part of it all, but it looks like he's afraid of something bigger." Enzo stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. "May, do you remember a man named Alberto Galli? He was one of Vittorio's associates. It could be important if you know anything about him." May closed her eyes, her brows furrowing as she sifted through her fragmented memories. After a long pause, she opened her eyes and whispered, "Yes, Alberto. He handled all the money. Everything went through him. Vittorio trusted him more than anyone else. I saw him many times, but I never fully understood what they were doing." Luke felt the weight of the revelation settle on him. They were dealing with powerful, dangerous people, and now that they knew too much, their lives were at risk. But Luke was determined to finish what they started, for his mother's sake, and for justice. "Enzo," Luke said with resolve, "we need to track down Alberto Galli. He might be the next target, or the next one trying to cover this all up. If we can find out what he knows, we can bring down this entire network." Enzo nodded, already thinking ahead. "I'll start tracking his movements. If he's still active in Milan, we have a chance to find him before he disappears too." May looked at Luke, fear clear in her eyes. "Luke, please, be careful. These people are dangerous. I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Luke held her hands tightly, meeting her gaze with determination. "Don't worry, Mom. I'm going to end this. We'll get through this together." As night fell over the city, Luke and Enzo realized they were closer than ever to uncovering the full truth, but the danger loomed larger than before. Vittorio Conti's network was starting to unravel, but there were still many secrets left to expose, and powerful people willing to do anything to keep those secrets buried. As the clock neared midnight, Luke and Enzo began plotting their next move, to find Alberto Galli. Milan, with its luxurious facade and high-stakes business world, would be their next stop. But they knew Galli wouldn't be easy to track down. If he was as deeply involved as they believed, he would be well guarded and protected by powerful allies. "He'll have layers of protection," Enzo said, studying a map of Milan they had spread on the table. "Galli plays the part of a respectable businessman, but behind the scenes, he's likely involved in some of the dirtiest deals you can imagine." Luke, sitting across from him, kept his focus on Angelo's journal, the key that could bring down this entire operation. "If we find him, this could be over, Enzo. My mum can finally live in peace." Enzo nodded, but his expression was cautious. "Yes, but we have to be smart. We don't know how far Galli's reach goes. If we make a move too soon, he could vanish. Or worse, retaliate before we're ready." The plan was set. Early the next morning, they would leave for Milan, knowing the stakes had never been higher. As the city slept, Luke and Enzo prepared for the next chapter in their dangerous pursuit of justice. Every street and every corner felt like an obstacle on the road to uncovering the truth. Enzo had secured a meeting with a former associate of Alberto Galli, someone who had once worked behind the scenes, but had managed to escape before things got too dangerous. The man, a nervous-looking accountant named Johnny, sat across from them, stirring his coffee. "I won't lie," Johnny began cautiously, glancing around the cafe as if someone might be listening. "Galli is smart, very smart. He doesn't leave a trace. Even when things start to get dangerous, he has this incredible ability to slip out of trouble." "And now, where is he?" Luke asked, his frustration barely contained. Johnny hesitated, his eyes darting around again. "Lately, he's been keeping a low profile, but I know he's still managing some discreet operations. If you want to find him, there's a chance you'll catch him at the Palazzo del Oro. He goes there for meetings with influential businessmen, but I'll warn you, he's always got heavy security. Make the wrong move, and it'll be over before it even starts." Enzo thanked Johnny for the information, paid for the coffee, and they headed back to the car. "This confirms what we suspected," Enzo said, as they drove through the busy streets of Milan. "Galli's still a major player, operating in the shadows. If we go after him at the Palazzo, we need to be prepared for anything." Luke nodded, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. Confronting Galli was necessary if they were ever going to end the years of pain and fear his mother had endured. The thought made his heart race, but he knew it was the only way forward. That night, Luke found himself wide awake, mentally preparing for the confrontation that was to come. They were closer than ever to putting the pieces together, but the next day would be crucial. The next morning, Luke and Enzo arrived at the Palazzo del Oro, an imposing building that radiated power and exclusivity. Luxury cars lined the front entrance as businessmen in sharp suits came and went, while security guards carefully watched over the place. "We'll blend in as regular businessmen," Enzo said, adjusting his suit. "The key is not to raise suspicion until we're close to Galli." They entered the building smoothly, but the real challenge lay ahead, locating Galli without tipping him off. The place was bustling with activity, and security was scattered throughout. Luke forced himself to stay calm, scanning the room for any sign of their target. After a few minutes, Enzo nudged Luke, discreetly pointing toward a more secluded table. There he was, Alberto Galli, sitting with two serious-looking men, exuding an air of confidence. He seemed relaxed, as though he had no reason to worry, yet his posture suggested someone always ready to act. Luke felt a surge of anger as he watched the man who had likely endangered his mother. But he knew he couldn't let his emotions get the better of him. Not yet. "We need evidence," Enzo whispered. "We can't confront him now. If we don't have concrete proof, he'll walk free and disappear." Let's try to get closer and listen in. They carefully maneuvered through the crowd, positioning themselves close enough to overhear the conversation. Gali was talking about investments and transactions, but the language he used hinted at something far more sinister. "The funds are ready," Gali said quietly, "but we need to move fast. We can't let Vittorio's name get tied to these operations. Too many people are already watching us." Luke froze at the mention of Vittorio Conti. Even after all these years, Vittorio's name was still central to the criminal activities. Gali was clearly one of the key players still holding the operation together. "We need to record this," Luke whispered to Enzo, who was already discreetly positioning his phone to capture the conversation. "If we can tie Vittorio to these transactions, we'll have the evidence we need to take Gali down." The conversation continued, with Gali casually discussing illegal transactions involving offshore accounts, falsified documents, and bribes to major corporations. The ease with which he spoke about these crimes was chilling. Suddenly, Gali stood up. "I think this meeting has gone on long enough. Let me know when everything's finalized." Luke and Enzo exchanged a quick glance. This was their chance. If Gali got away now, he could disappear for good. They needed to act. "We'll follow him," Enzo whispered, as they quickly slipped out of the hall, trailing behind Gali without being noticed. They followed him down a corridor and out toward a side exit where Gali's car was waiting. The plan had gone smoothly so far, but now came the critical moment. As Gali approached his car, Enzo made his move. "Mr. Gali," Enzo said firmly, stepping forward. Gali stopped, turning slowly to face them. His eyes narrowed, taking in Enzo and Luke. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice sharp. Luke stepped forward, his anger barely controlled. "We're the ones who are going to make you pay for everything you've done. We know about Vittorio Conti. We know about my mother." For a moment, Gali's expression faltered. Shock and anger flashed across his face. But then, a cold smile spread across his lips. "You think you can touch me?" he sneered. "You think you can take down someone like me?" "We have the evidence," Enzo said, holding up the phone that had recorded the incriminating conversation. "You're not getting away with this." Gali's face twisted in fury. He stepped back toward his car, but before he could move, his security team noticed the tension. In seconds, the situation exploded. The guards rushed forward, forcing Luke and Enzo to back off. "Justice will catch up to you," Luke shouted as he was pushed back by the guards. Gali got into his car, but before driving off, he shot one last look at Luke, his voice dripping with menace. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into, kid. This is far from over." As Gali's car sped away, Luke felt the adrenaline start to fade, but his resolve remained strong. They had lost the opportunity to capture him right then, but they had the evidence they needed. The final showdown with Alberto Gali was only just beginning, and Luke knew it was now a matter of time before the truth came to light. Back at their apartment in Milan, Luke was restless. The recording Enzo had managed to capture was a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't the final blow they needed. They had enough evidence to tie Gali to illegal activities, but they knew it was just the tip of the iceberg. The web of corruption and crime surrounding Vittorio Conti and his associates was deep, and bringing it all down would require more. "Gali knows we're close," Enzo said, his eyes fixed on the laptop in front of him. "He's going to start covering his tracks now, burying evidence, cutting ties." "We can't let him," Luke replied, determination hardening his voice. "We have to move fast before he disappears again." As night fell over Milan, Luke and Enzo knew that the clock was ticking. They were on the verge of uncovering everything, but the danger had never been greater. "He'll move money, erase trails, and use his allies to throw us off course. We need to act fast," Luke said, pacing back and forth. He stopped, locking eyes with Enzo. "We need to expose this to the public. We can't rely on the authorities alone. If Gali or the others have contacts inside the system, they'll manipulate it and get away with everything. Enzo considered the suggestion and then nodded in agreement. You're right. We need a dual approach. We'll gather more evidence that directly links Gali to Vittorio and push the story out to the media, making sure once it's out, it can't be silenced. As Enzo worked on organizing the files and preparing the recording, Luke picked up the phone, a growing sense of anxiety gnawing at him. He needed to check on his mother. Now that they were closing in on Gali and his network, the danger felt more real than ever. "Hi, Mom," Luke said when May answered, her voice soft but worried. "Everything okay over there?" "I'm fine, Luke, but I'm worried about you," she responded, her concern palpable through the phone. "This confrontation with Gali. What are you going to do now?" Luke sighed. "We've got the evidence, Mom. We recorded Gali talking about the transactions and even mentioning Vittorio's name. It's the beginning of the end for them. But we still need more to make sure they can't escape." There was a pause on the other end. "Luke, there's something I never told you," May said hesitantly. "When I worked for Vittorio, I saw something that terrified me, but I could never prove it." Luke's heart began to race. "What do you mean? What did you see?" "Documents," May said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were coded, but I managed to get copies of some of them. I hid them because I never thought I'd need them again. They're still at our old house in the basement." Luke stood in silence for a moment, trying to process the revelation. Coded documents. This could be exactly what they needed. "Mom, these documents could be the key to bringing down Gali and everyone involved. I'm going there now." After hanging up, Luke quickly filled Enzo in on the new development. Enzo agreed without hesitation. They needed those documents before Gali could cover his tracks or flee. Time was of the essence. That same night, Luke and Enzo made their way to the old Torres family home. Luke hadn't been there since his teenage years, before his mother had disappeared. The house stood abandoned, draped in dust and silence, as though time itself had forgotten it. Every room seemed to echo with memories of happier days. But the overwhelming emptiness following May's disappearance haunted the place. "Do you know where the documents are?" Enzo asked, as they moved cautiously through the living room, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. "In the basement," Luke replied, his voice low. "She hid them there before she vanished. If they're still there, we can end this once and for all." The basement smelled of mildew, dark and damp. Luke knelt down, pulling aside old boxes and furniture that had long been untouched. After a few minutes of searching, he found what he was looking for, a small metal box tucked away behind an old cabinet. "This is it," Luke said, a mix of relief and apprehension in his voice. They pried the box open, revealing a pile of yellowed papers and a small notebook filled with coded notes and numbers. Enzo flipped through the documents carefully, his expression growing serious as he scanned the pages. "This is much more than we expected," Enzo murmured, his eyes widening. "These papers directly link Gali, Vittorio, and some other big names to secret offshore accounts and illegal transactions. This is explosive. If we release this, they won't be able to run." Luke stared at the documents, emotions flooding him. Finally, they had the missing piece, the evidence to not only bring down Gali, but to dismantle Vittorio's entire network and clear his mother's name. "We're taking this to the press," Luke said with determination. "This will destroy Gali and Vittorio's entire legacy of corruption." As they left the house, carrying the incriminating documents, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something monumental. They had what they needed. Now, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. But just as they neared the street, Enzo suddenly stopped. His gaze fixed on the end of the road, where two black cars sat with their headlights off. They were clearly waiting for something or someone. "We've got trouble," Enzo whispered, grabbing Luke and pulling him behind the fence that bordered the house. They crouched in the shadows, watching as the cars remained parked, the silhouettes of figures barely visible inside. Luke's pulse quickened. "Do you think they followed us?" Luke whispered. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." "Quietly," Enzo replied, his eyes scanning for any movement. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the car doors opened. Several men dressed in dark suits stepped out, scanning the area. They were looking for something, or someone. Luke felt the tension build as he watched them move toward the house. Enzo leaned in close, his voice barely audible. "We can't take them on. We need to get to the car fast." As quietly as they could, Luke and Enzo slipped through the shadows along the side of the house, avoiding the men who were now inspecting the front. They moved swiftly, every step calculated to avoid being detected. Finally, they reached their car parked around the corner. Without a word, they climbed in, and Enzo started the engine, keeping the headlights off as they pulled away as quietly as possible. Only when they were a safe distance from the house did they allow themselves to breathe. "They were waiting for us," Luke said, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. "They knew we'd come for the documents." Enzo nodded grimly. "Galli must have suspected something. He's pulling all the stops to cover his tracks now. But we got what we came for," Luke said, glancing at the box of documents in the back seat. "We have what we need to end this." As they drove back to the city, Luke knew that this was far from over. Galli and his men would come after them once they realized what had been taken. But with the evidence in their hands, the countdown to exposing the truth had begun. The final pieces were in place. Now, it was a race against time to bring down the network that had caused so much pain and destruction. "I think Galli found out we're here," Luke muttered, his voice tight with anxiety. The black cars sat idle for only a few seconds before their doors opened, and 3 men dressed in dark suits stepped out. Their faces were hard, focused, and ready for whatever came next. Luke's heart pounded in his chest. They needed to get out before they were spotted. "Looks like Galli isn't taking any chances," Enzo whispered, glancing around. "We need to leave, now. If they get those documents, it's all over." With the men closing in, Luke and Enzo quickly retreated, moving around to the opposite side of the house. They moved fast but quietly, adrenaline pumping through their veins. The men were getting closer, but Luke knew they couldn't afford to lose the documents. This was the final piece to bring down Galli's entire operation. They managed to slip far enough away to reach the car, which they had hidden on a side street. Enzo didn't waste a second. He started the engine, and within moments, they were speeding off into the night, the precious documents safely stashed away in the back seat. "We made it out," Luke said, breathless. "But they're after us now. We need to move fast." Enzo nodded, eyes locked on the road. "Tomorrow, we'll hand these documents over to the press and the authorities. The whole world is going to know what Galli, Vittorio, and their network have been doing. They won't escape this time." As they drove back toward the city, Luke felt a mix of relief and tension. They were close to the end, but there were still hurdles to overcome. The truth was finally in their hands. But the danger hadn't passed. Galli's network would retaliate if they sensed the imminent collapse of their empire. The next morning, the tension was palpable as Luke and Enzo prepared for the decisive moment, delivering the documents to the press and authorities. They knew Galli's men were watching, waiting for any opportunity to snatch the evidence or silence those involved. But they couldn't wait any longer. Too many lives were at stake, especially May's. With the documents secured in a briefcase, Luke and Enzo made their way to the major TV station where investigative journalist Sandro Mancini awaited them. Mancini was known for exposing large-scale criminal operations, and he wasn't afraid of the consequences. He was the perfect ally to help them broadcast the truth. When they arrived at the station, Mancini greeted them with a firm handshake. The seriousness of the situation was evident in his face, and the urgency in the air was undeniable. "Thank you for trusting me with this," Mancini said, leading them to a secure room. "You've got something big here, and we'll make sure the public knows the whole truth." Luke handed over the briefcase, and Mancini began flipping through the documents. His eyes widened as he absorbed the evidence. A clear trail linking Galli, Vittorio Conti, and numerous other powerful figures to money laundering, bribery, and information trafficking. "This is explosive," Mancini said, visibly shocked. "We'll release this immediately. The weight of this evidence will shake the foundations of several major institutions." While Mancini prepared to broadcast the report, Enzo received a phone call. He stepped away to answer it, and when he returned, his expression was tense. "We've got a problem," Enzo said, voice low. "Galli found out about the report. He's on the move." A chill ran down Luke's spine. "What's he going to do?" "He'll probably try to flee," Enzo replied. "He knows that once this goes public, he has no way out. He's likely trying to leave the country right now." Mancini, overhearing the conversation, nodded resolutely. "If he tries to run, Interpol will be on him. We're broadcasting this live on every major news outlet. It'll put pressure on the authorities to act quickly." Within an hour, the report hit the airwaves. Galli's name, once associated with power and influence, was now synonymous with corruption, financial crimes, and human trafficking. The revelation that Vittorio Conti's criminal empire was still alive and well stunned the public. International media quickly picked up the story, and the fallout was immediate. Law enforcement agencies across Milan and internationally began to act. Arrest warrants were issued, and raids commenced on properties connected to Galli and his associates. Luke watched the news unfold on the station's monitors, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. The evidence was now too public to be covered up, but Galli was still free. "We need to make sure he's arrested," Luke said to Enzo, his voice filled with urgency. "If he escapes, he could rebuild everything elsewhere." "Interpol's already on alert," Enzo reassured him. "He won't get far this time." The following hours were a blur of rapid developments. Galli made a desperate attempt to flee the country, but was intercepted at Milan's airport by Interpol agents just before boarding a private jet. The press captured every moment as Galli, once a man untouchable by the law, was handcuffed and led away. His face, once unflinching and arrogant, was now twisted in anger and defeat. The dismantling of Galli's network continued at a breakneck pace. His associates, along with those tied to Vittorio's legacy, were rounded up and arrested. The criminal empire that had terrorized Luke's mother and many others was finally falling apart. For Luke, the greatest victory came when he returned home to find May sitting in the living room, watching the news coverage with tears in her eyes. She turned to Luke, her expression one of profound relief and gratitude. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You finally pulled me out of the darkness." Luke moved toward her, hugging her tightly. "We did this together, Mom. You survived it all." They stood there in silence, letting the weight of the last few years lift off their shoulders. The fear and pain they had carried for so long were finally starting to fade, and for the first time in years, Luke felt that their future was bright. In the days that followed, the press continued to cover the collapse of Galli's network. The trial was swift, with Galli and his associates convicted thanks to the overwhelming evidence. Justice had been served. Luke and Enzo watched the final broadcast with a sense of accomplishment. They had risked everything, but they had achieved something great. "It's over," Enzo said, as they watched the trial's conclusion. "They've finally paid for everything. Luke nodded, staring out toward the horizon. The battle had been long and difficult, but now the future was filled with possibilities. His mother was safe, and the truth had triumphed. For the first time in a long time, Luke felt at peace.